Hi, I'm Judy Perlman. Welcome to Meet the Problem Solvers. And we're going to dig in on a lot of levels. I'm very excited about my guests today. Jamila Bradley is an activist and policy consultant who's been working with homelessness for many years. Jeff has been working in communities throughout the U.S. On issues of homelessness for 25 years. So we have a breadth of experience, and people who've been watching this show know that I also have been working in homelessness for a long time. So I think we have some interesting and diverse perspectives to bring to this most important topic of the role of racism in homelessness and pulling out those lessons into some larger context as well. Jeff, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. But thanks for offering to sort of kick us off with sort of a historical perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important when we try to understand homelessness today that we do it both in its kind of broader societal context and its broader historical context. There are a lot of myths about homelessness. One is that it's new, that we created it in the last few decades, which is just simply not true. It's been with us on the landscape in the United States since the beginning and has come in waves, and we're in one of those waves now. Another myth is that homelessness is colorblind, that it affects all races and ethnicities the same way, which is also not true. We know that people of color are dramatically more likely to be homeless in the United States, and that's true in community after community. It's not a big city issue or a small city issue, a southern issue or a West Coast issue. It's true everywhere that, in particular, African Americans and Native Americans are much more likely to become homeless than their white peers. And that's no accident. It's the result of centuries of oppression and bad public policy that was really designed to exclude people of color. And so if you look back at housing policy in the 20th century, the legacy of redlining, the exclusion of people of color from GI Bill benefits, from Social Security and other benefits, from the ability to buy housing in various ways through policies like redlining and like residential segregation that happened through local policy and federal policy. If you look even further back than that, the way Native Americans essentially had their land stolen generation after generation, federal policies like the Indian Removal Act in 1830 that made massive numbers of Native American people homeless. And those policies are never really talked about in our understanding of contemporary homelessness, but they create the backdrop in which contemporary homelessness plays out along racial lines. And so you look at something like the policy of redlining, which kind of targeted home ownership to white communities and excluded people of color from being able to access mortgages. That was an opportunity to get in the housing market in the 1930s and 1940s. And when that opportunity was essentially given to white people and not given to people of color, you have multi-generational opportunity for wealth accumulation among some families and not others. And that was done in a very deliberately racist way. It was policies like that that created the circumstances in which we now see people of color dramatically overrepresented in the homeless population.
Yeah, I don't know if people have had a chance to visit our Facebook page, which is called Meet the Problem Solvers. On there, we had, before each show now, we have a number of sort of pieces of information or videos or articles. Two things that Jeff had written in the Huffington Post we put up. And the statistics were just amazing. The disparity of that wealth gap is something like 6 to 1. White people have wealth, and was it?
Well, there's a persistent.
Yeah, help us understand that.
There's a persistent income gap
Yep.
where white people make more than people of color, white men make more than white women, and women of color certainly. But there's also this wealth gap where you have white households with significantly more wealth, and that's in home equity. It's in investments in the stock market, and all of that was the result of these generational policies that have happened really over 100 plus years.
Yeah. So where do you plug into these issues with some of the work that you've been doing?
So working specifically in youth homelessness and then in diversity, equity, and inclusion across different sorts of nonprofits and in the private sector and in government, you see this play out in a lot of different ways. I think first and foremost, you see a lot of systems that are essentially trying to create good outcomes for people that are experiencing homelessness, but ultimately end up reproducing harm because they're not willing to name the issue. And the issue is structural racism. The issue is global anti-Blackness and generational poverty. And not naming those things create systems where the people who slip through the cracks are going to continue to be the most marginalized. That's our Black and brown young people. That's our Black and brown chronic homeless people, our Black and brown veterans, and anybody else that doesn't sort of check the white, cis, able-bodied box.
Right. Right.
And you look at the sort of feeder systems into homelessness, it's things like the foster care system, which we know dramatically includes young people of color, much more than white people. It's the criminal justice system that releases people from jail and prison straight onto the streets and in the shelters. And so when you have these systems that are already disproportionately affecting communities of color, then also resulting in homelessness for folks, we have an unequal inflow. And yet then when you try to create colorblind solutions, they don't work. And they don't work because we're not diagnosing the problem right. We're not seeing the racial dimensions and the racial inequity that's at play.
And I think it's really easy for people to sort of ignore some of the history or the structural factors that really play into this and be like, well, we're individuals. We're in charge of our own outcomes. We hear, incredible stories of people surviving hardship all the time. As Americans, we sort of internalize this bootstrappy ideology that everybody's got the same chance. And fundamentally, we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to the people that are suffering by engaging with issues in this way. When you think about somebody that ends up on the streets, nobody ever considers how they got there in a meaningful way besides maybe they made bad decisions or maybe they were on drugs. And really important factors like your zip code, right? Something you would never consider to weigh into your health or the well-being of your life end up having huge impacts on human beings that enter our system. Network impoverishment is a huge issue. There's entire communities of people that don't know one person they could borrow $100 for to get their car fixed. So instead, where privileged communities are able to pool resources and opportunities and jobs, these communities, they pool vulnerability. They go to predatory lenders. They may engage in an underground economy. They may have to make different kinds of decisions to make ends meet, and that puts them at more risk, both from our state systems like the police and foster care, and also from poverty.
And I think one of the problems is that you sort of have created this problem structurally, and yet we try to solve it individually. So we've created homelessness through massive cuts in affordable housing. The HUD budget is a fraction of what it was 40 years ago. It's something like 18% of what it was in the early 1970s. And those massive budget cuts destabilized communities, decreased the stock in affordable housing, which we had a surplus of in 1970. Now we have a deficit of affordable housing units in the millions compared to those who need and qualify for affordable housing. We've created an unequal healthcare system, an unequal education system, these huge structural fallout of bad policy, racist policy, deliberate policy, but bad policy nonetheless. And yet the way we try to solve homelessness is through a 20-unit pilot of supportive housing and a little bit of case management, and expect that to work. And I think it comes back to what you were saying, Jamila, about the kind of blaming of the person for you're homeless because of your mental illness, because of your drug use, because of the so-called bad choices you make, not understanding that what we've done is to create a set of public policies that almost makes homelessness inevitable for many people.
This is really reminding me of the decision that I made as a senior in college. I thought I was going to be the world's greatest psychotherapist. I studied psychology, sociology, and ethics. And boy, did I have a well-rounded understanding, I thought, of individual perspectives and individual lives. And then I found feminist theory, and I was like, oh my God, absolutely not. I mean, psychotherapy, traditional psychotherapy is just like that. It's like, how are we going to allow you and fix you to work in this 20 units pilot or in that scary bad marriage, as opposed to there's something really wrong upstream that we did wrong that we need to fix now. And so now I work more like you at the systemic level.
Well, and of course, both are important, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's critical
yeah.
that good social work and case
Yeah.
managers and housing programs and the kind of on the ground work that is really ending homelessness for people,
Yeah.
in spite of those systemic issues, in spite of the structural racism that's still at play through ongoing housing discrimination and job discrimination. The critical work of helping people get reconnected to housing and community and jobs and connection and meaning and relationships is vital, and we have to support that, and it needs to be scaled up because it's working. Like we've seen in our work, hundreds of thousands of people move from homelessness into housing. We know that sort of technologies of housing subsidies and combination of supportive services that do that. We've not scaled them up, and we've also not come at them through a lens of racial equity.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the other point that people really miss, and this is sort of like very big picture, is that like ultimately we created a system of people who own and people who don't. And everything in the social service world is meant to essentially catch the screw-ups of a white supremacist and capitalist system. So if we are expecting our social services to meet the needs of the people who fall through the cracks of capitalism and white supremacy, we need to build a social system that is strong enough, that is resourced enough, and that is looking at this problem holistically enough to be as strong as capitalism is. And it's pretty strong.
So I want to come back to that, Jamila, because I think there's some stuff to unpack there. This is Meet the Problem Solvers. I'm Judy Perlman. My guests today are Jamila Bradley and Jeff Olivet, and we're talking about structural racism as a root cause. Wow, I'm really having trouble with this one today. Structural racism and its role in homelessness.
It's a hard topic.
It is a hard topic. It is a hard topic. You said a phrase that, what was the phrase that you just said at the beginning of what you said? Oh, you don't remember either. Could you just unpack your last statement a bit?
Yeah, just that like essentially the whole web of social services that we have, whether you're thinking of foster care, DYS, Medicare, all of these things, right? Shelters and the shelter system, even the incarceral system to some extent, are meant to account for the failures of capitalism. And since we're in America and since the world is the world, it's also white supremacy.
Okay, but just help me understand, how are those systems trying to, what is the relationship between those social service sector systems and capitalism? Just help me understand the connection you're making there.
So there are people in America and in the world that were set up to be owners, and they were set up sort of going back to the history that Jeff said a very long time ago. They are the people who own the buildings that the poor black people will rent from. They are the people who will sue those poor black people when they evict them. They are the people who will, pretty much own the lives of the people that aren't able to own. And when your starting line was 70 to 100 years after everybody else's, your capacity to catch up is really low. And every mistake that you make in the system that causes you to fall deeper and deeper into poverty actively benefits the people who are the owners within that system.
One way to imagine this would be on a monopoly game, where some people get to start and go get their wad of money and their little token and go around the property, go around the board buying up all the properties, putting houses, putting hotels, buying up the utilities. And then I wouldn't even call it 70 years later, I'd call it 250 years later. If you really look at the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the domestic slave trade, the era of Jim Crow, and now mass incarceration, you're talking about 250, 300 years later, that many laps around the monopoly board. Then you start people at go, give them the same amount of money that the others got 250 years ago, maybe, and say, good luck to you, it's an equal playing field now. And you can never get ahead that way. Everybody already owns the property. Everybody is already in a position of power that's impossible to disrupt at that point. And I think that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And it frankly leaves some people right on the edge of homelessness all the time. And it's not everybody. I've never believed that everybody's one paycheck away from homelessness. I don't think it's true. I think it's true for a lot of folks. And I think those folks are disproportionately people of color. Again, that's not to say that no white people are poor or no white people have frayed social networks or financial networks. It's just if you simply look at the numbers, African Americans are at least 5 times more overrepresented in the homeless population than their general population numbers. Native Americans as much as 8 to 1 compared to general population numbers, and white folks are underrepresented. And there is no accounting for that except for structural racism that has its historical roots and it has its contemporary manifestations, like landlord discrimination, like employment discrimination, like overrepresentation in criminal justice, child welfare systems, and all of those others.
Right, and I was remembering in one of your articles, so we're talking about sort of the disproportionate inflow based on this, but also leaving homelessness is much easier for white people. It's much harder for black people. And that was sort of a very basic statistic that was not broken down by criminal justice involvement or underemployment or anything like, or limited educational attainment, just overall.
And very complicated to exit homelessness for Latinx people now, especially given the current political climate and the anti-immigration and anti-Latino sentiment at play in society, where now people aren't coming in for even housing and services that they might be eligible for out of fear of having their family split up, having family and loved ones deported. And so, you know, all of these barriers get set up at the front end that destabilize communities of color, and at the back end as people are trying to exit homelessness.
And then even within the system, you see all the time, you know, and we're just now starting to collect data around this and get really serious about equity in our systems, but the number of people that face consequences in foster care, in the homelessness system, even in the department in juvenile justice, who are those people? What are the
preschool expulsions. I'm sorry, I'm getting very squawky, but that's crazy.
Yeah.
And the implicit biases that we have around who is coded aggressive and who is considered a threat and how many chances you get. Because ultimately, right, in order to get from homeless through the system to housed, you have to be able to make mistakes along the way. That is, building a resilient system is super important. And the system is never quite as resilient as it is for white people as it is for people of color. And that's a huge part of the problem.
All right, so we set the table. Here's a big problem. Here's a big issue. It's really a big concern. And in fact, we're sort of spinning our wheels if we don't go upstream and think about these causes and think about these barriers. But then the question is, so what can we do about it? How do you are both major thinkers about this, and you're also working in communities. So help us understand how do you turn this awareness into action?
I think one thing we need is to elevate the voices of people who are most impacted by these issues. We've so often tried to end homelessness with a bunch of social workers and policy people and elected officials and folks who have never been homeless themselves making decisions on behalf of. We have well-meaning organizations run by white people and white boards acting on behalf of their staff, who are often much more reflective of the diversity of the people they serve, and certainly large numbers of people of color who are homeless. When you start deciding how budgets get spent and how programs get designed in a closed-door session without the people who are most impacted at the table, you're going to come to the wrong decision. So I think that's one thing that we all need to do, is sort of work together to elevate the voices of people who have been homeless, and in particular people of color who have been homeless.
I think the other thing is, like, as individuals, like, coming sort of chest to chest with a really hard truth that, like, due to the fact that, like, white supremacy is global, that this is a country that was stolen from indigenous people, like, we are on stolen land, and that, you know, capitalism is set up in such a way that if you are winning, it is at someone's direct expense, but getting really honest with ourselves about the way that that plays out in our lives and the opportunities that that grants us, and doing what we can to relocate that power, specifically in organizations, in state systems, and seeing the people that are most likely to be impacted by the system as experts instead of as threats or as potential dangers, because they're not ultimately.
I think the other thing, and Judy, you mentioned this, but going upstream even while we're doing the downstream work. So again, I think it's critical that we keep doing the stuff that's working, and that policymakers and those who are involved with philanthropy or other funders fund the stuff that works, because there's a lot that works. We've developed a lot of very, very effective strategies over the last several decades. But we also need to go upstream, and I don't think we're doing that piece well. And what that starts looking like is not a homelessness system that operates in a silo, but one that is deeply connected to the healthcare system, deeply connected to education, deeply connected to criminal justice, and all of these other systems that are, you know, essentially pouring people into homelessness. And so, you know, how do you both bail the bathtub at the same time that you're turning the faucet off? We've been good at bailing the bathtub in a lot of ways. You know, people will say, well, the current approaches haven't been effective. I disagree. I think we've housed hundreds of thousands of people in this country, and you can look at national models that have done that. You can look at local models that have done that. innovations like Housing First, or like if you look at the recent reductions in veteran homelessness, it hasn't been rocket science how that's been done. It was housing vouchers combined with a universal healthcare system for veterans.
Yeah.
So if you could replicate that on a large enough scale, it's not hard to solve homelessness. What's hard to do is to shift public belief that we can solve homelessness and to shift public policy in such a way that budgets follow.
It's a self-awareness too. It's a humbleness. We've been pretty humbled in the homeless world by seeing how, our paradigms really have been proven wrong. So instead of making people, when I started working in this, it was like, you got to be sober for 90 days and then you'll get to go to the next program where you'll have to earn and save $2,000. Guess what? I know a lot of people who look a lot like me who aren't sober for 90 days and don't earn and save vast sums of money. So we used to set up all these hurdles, and now I think we've figured out Housing First, which is a concept that basically says house people first and, figure out what it's going to take. Take the responsibility to retain that tenancy, take that on as a social system, as a service system, that it's our job to be stabilizing, helping that person stabilize their own lives, rather than making them jump through hoops and giving them finally housing at the end of it.
And I think that that's a super important point when we talk about housing first. Like, we are talking about homelessness, right? We are not talking about substance use disorders. We are not talking about domestic violence. We are talking about homelessness. So that means people need a home. They can address the laundry list of other things when they're housed, but how do you expect someone to put the entire, the pieces of an entire functional life together without the house part?
Yeah.
Most people with houses don't have the entire, all the moving pieces of their lives running smoothly and working. And I think it's really about dropping the moralism and dropping the paternalism and being like, look, are we a country, are we a community that thinks it's okay for people to live on the streets? Doesn't matter what they're doing, do we think that that's okay?
Yeah.
And if that problem has racial dimensions to it, which we know this one does, we know that people of color are more likely to become homeless and have a harder time exiting homelessness, then you can't come at that with colorblind solutions. You have to come at it with a clear-eyed racial equity analysis and a clear-eyed set of racially equitable policies that start looking like targeting resources towards communities that are most likely to be affected. It's what you'd look at in public health as sort of geographic hotspotting, where you look at where the problem is most severe and you put a lot of resources there. We do it around HIV, we do it around maternal child health, we do it around polio outbreaks, and we haven't figured that out on homelessness yet.
We do it around bed bugs.
Right.
I mean,
That's right.
seriously, we do it about a lot of things.
Right. And another huge issue there too is that we do it and we claim those people. We let those people belong to us. When we talk about veteran homelessness, they're our homeless veterans. Mm-hmm. When we talk about women fleeing domestic violence, they're our constituents, they're our people. And if we started doing that for our Black and Brown community members, we would have a fundamentally new system wrapping around them.
Yeah.
And I think what it entails is a shift from charity to justice. I think our mindset collectively around addressing homelessness over the last 40 years has been one of charity. Churches get together and do a food pantry. Organizations emerge doing shelter and clothing banks. And then maybe that starts shifting into temporary housing or transitional housing. Maybe that starts shifting into permanent housing. But it's a one person by one person charity mindset, not a social justice, racial justice, gender equality mindset that would
Structural.
say housing is a human right. And it's a human right for everybody. And we especially need to target our attention to communities of color because they've been most at risk for homelessness and most likely to experience homelessness for a really long time. So let's
and have the
that ship.
greatest barriers to get out of homelessness. So we don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to say, because people so often say to me, as someone who's worked in homelessness, what do I do when someone asks me for money on the street? I feel very uncomfortable. I never know what to do. And so I figured we would, these people have worked in homelessness for probably more of your proportion of your life than mine. But anyway, I won't go into the math. I don't do the math. What do you guys want to say about what do you do when someone asks you for money, or how can you help somebody watching this make sense of that transaction in their mind?
I mean, first of all, it's not a transaction. I think every day in our lives, people ask us for things. Sometimes we can give it, sometimes we can't. It's about setting up your own boundaries around it. If you're the sort of person that's going to occasionally give money, I would say drop the morals, give the money, tell the person to have a good day. If not, acknowledge that they're there. They're a person. Imagine how many people walk by and don't see you and what that must do to you emotionally. So say, hey, sorry I don't have anything for you, but have an awesome day. And I think that's enough.
Yeah. I mean, I do think if it's a really hot day, go buy a bottle of water. Give somebody a bottle of water. I mean,
But I think remembering choice too. If somebody asks you for money and somebody came back to me with a bottled water and a granola bar, I'd be like, I wanted money and I wanted it for a reason, which is fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's natural that people ask this question. You walk down Mass Ave through Central Square or Harvard Square, and there are folks around asking for money with their sign out. So I understand it. I understand the impulse to say, what do I do? And I think it's important that people come to their own sort of moral and ethical way of thinking about that. And I don't think there's a right answer. I think it's the wrong question to ask. I think at a certain level, when we default to that way of understanding homelessness as everyone's panhandling and what do I do about it, it first of all makes even more invisible the 98% of people experiencing homelessness who are not panhandling. And secondly, it sort of again reinforces the individual response to a structural problem. And so I think instead, looking at how we can be better advocates, looking for how we can support housing, the development of affordable housing in our own neighborhoods. So not NIMBYism, but YIMBYism, I heard it called the other day. Yes, in my backyard. Yes, we live in community together. And then really pressuring our political leaders to put money towards the stuff that's working and to reshape housing policy. So I kind of want to say, if you want to get involved, spend less time thinking about whether or not you're going to give money to somebody who asks, make a decision about that, do it or don't do it in the way that you were talking about.
Right.
And then get on with the more important work of advocating for real change in our society.
Right. And doing the work to advocate for racial equity. Confront that racist uncle. Like, do the work that other people can't do for you.
Take the risk. Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you both. This has been a really, really important and interesting conversation. We could probably do this every week and dig into it. Thanks for joining me. And now what I wanted to make sure is people have a chance to, register your thoughts. Send us an email at meettheproblemsolvers@gmail.com, or please visit us on Facebook.